I don't think of myself as a savior. I'm not the voice of anybody else. At best, I could be their megaphone. I could scream, but they have their own voice.
My next guest has a personal and professional journey that is a testament to the power of resilience, intellect, and our collective humanity. She has an unwavering commitment to human dignity and justice. She is an internationally recognized champion of human rights who has made multiple contributions to international law and human rights advocacy. Our guest is a woman whose legacy continues to inspire and guide the next generation of advocates dedicated to the principles of justice and equality, the Honorable Louise Arbour. Louise, thank you so much for joining us. You've had an extraordinary life, an extraordinary career. I just want to learn a lot about you and how you have busted through all manner of boundaries. Maybe the best place to start is childhood and growing up. Can you tell us about your family life and where you were raised and what made you, in a way, who you are?
I grew up in what was then called French Canada. Now we call just ourselves Quebecers. So in and of itself, I think that gives some insight into what maybe subsequently will become part of my politics. So in a sense, I grew up in a minority environment. But in many respects, this was completely obscured by the fact that I was fully educated in French. Mm-hmm. And so I had no interface with the majority of the country, the majority of the environment in which I lived. And it's the same as also about being a woman, because I was educated exclusively by women. In a very unorthodox way, at that time in Canada and in Quebec in particular, my parents were separated when I was very young, about 10. I have one younger brother. Okay. And so essentially my mother left. So she moved out with me, my brother, and our dog, took a little apartment and decided and she had not worked outside a family life at that point. So she opened a little women's clothing store and raised us
through that store.
Through that. What's really interesting when I think of it in retrospect is, in order to do that, and in the Mastercard Foundation, how much we talk about access to credit, and she didn't have anything.
So how did she start?
Well, in order to get a bank loan in those days in Quebec, you had to have your husband's signature. My father was nowhere to be seen. So as a then, how old would she have been? Late 30s, early 40s, late 30s maybe. She had to go to her father to get him
to sign
and to support her. She came from a family of merchants, like small commerce and so on. So my grandfather, nobody was very wealthy. This was kind of straight middle class, professional commerce people. But in retrospect, I think, seriously, you had to go to your dad with your 2 kids and your dog just to get him to sign off and get you to start a modest little business, which did well enough to support us until we were grown up. But also because of all the turmoil in my parents' relationship, I was put in boarding school.
In Quebec?
Yes. Obviously in an all-girls Catholic boarding school.
Was it very strict?
Run by nuns. It was very strict, very. And the education was, I learned Latin and Greek, but no English, which, come to think of it, the practical aspect of education had obviously escaped them. But I grew, and I was a boarder for 3 or 4 years, maybe. And then my mother didn't have enough money to keep me boarding, so I became a day student. But I stayed in the same school, if you could believe it, from grade 6 until I was 20 years old.
Wow.
Because these...
So you must have lifelong friends from that
of course,
environment.
they're still my friends. But what it means is, so I got a BA. You know, it was a classical education. So I was in the same school for 10 years. Now I'm one of their stars. It didn't look like that at the time. But, so when I went to law school...
And what drew you to law school?
I went to law school as many things I've done, a bit by default. I was not particularly interested or good in science. And in those days, most women, young girls, went into nursing, or at the end of a BA, some would do a master's like in history or anthropology to teach. So, or they do a year of kind of teacher's college. So in my graduating class, which was maybe 45 of us, 50 max, maybe less, I think I'm the only one who went to law school, and 2 went to medical school, and others went teaching. But when I showed up on the university campus in a classroom of then 300, of which was not catastrophic, it was about 10% women. So 30 is not nothing, but 30 and 300 is not a lot. But I had never been not in a uniform. Took me hours every day to decide what to wear.
Your mother's boutique store didn't pay off there.
No, because this was for more grown-up women, not exactly. You could appreciate the kind of stuff I would wear. And then competition with men. I assumed that, they had gone to all these great, renowned colleges. I thought, oh my God, I'm going to get creamed. And then when the grades came out at Christmas, I have to say I worked because my last years of college, I wasn't exactly shining. I was preoccupied with, again, lots of students' politics. But when I got to law school, I thought, oh my God, this is the test. And I remember the grades were posted. So you had to go, it was a board, you had to take a ruler to find. Thankfully, with A, I was somewhere that you had to look at your grades. So it looked okay, and then I looked at the rest. It looked really good. And
so not only were you at the top of the list because your last name started with A, but you really were at the top of the list.
Yes. And when I saw that, I thought, oh my God, if this is the competition, bring it on.
Listen, I want to go back for a moment when you said you were raised by women. So clearly it was Mom and her hard work and her courage. Must have been many friendships at that school, strict as it was. Perhaps the teachers, the nuns who were there. Talk a little bit about that experience. And well, I know you say you're not introspective, but just talk about what you observed about them and their leadership.
Well, in the case of my mother, with whom I stayed very close all my life, in fact, she died 5 years ago. She was 97. I remember she told me at some point when she turned, 94 or something, she said to me, objectively, I know 94 years old is old. But she said, I don't feel that old, but having a 70-year-old daughter that kills me. And now, as I get older, I get her. Yeah. For me to have a 47-year-old daughter, I think, where did that come from? So my mother was, she was strong in a very unassuming way, not ambitious, but very alert to the necessities of, she would say to me all the time, the only important thing is get yourself into a position where you never, ever have to depend on anybody. You have to look after yourself and your children. That's it. She was also, if there's anything critical, but she was very concerned about appearances. So in a sense, where one, maybe because her fit in her world was awkward, not to have a husband at 37, 40 years old. In those days also, if you could believe it, she could not obtain a divorce except by an act of parliament.
What?
Yes. Until 1968 in Canada, divorce is federal jurisdiction, and there was no procedure. So you had to get, it was called a private bill. So the law changed, and immediately when it became more accessible, she obtained a divorce. But so it's not that she was an outcast, but she didn't fit in the social construct of her era, and that preoccupied her. So she was, in my opinion, always overly preoccupied with appearances, what will people think, and maybe in reaction to that, I have zero interest in what people think about me. I care about people's opinions and engage, but at that kind of social level. So yeah.
So in a way, you took Mom's advice to heart, not only just be independent in terms of financial independence, but just be truly independent.
And more intellectually independent, I suppose, and socially, which was not necessarily her message. And, you know, in those days, women didn't talk about being feminist, but these nuns, at one level, you might think, they've surrendered all their life to a very strict, sheltered order. But at the same time, first of all, they were better educated than the majority of women of their generation. And they were entirely self-administered. They became very wealthy as an order. Well, mind you, it's because they didn't have to pay tax. Anyway, there's other reasons for that. They held fantastic real estate, but they were very competent women. So in a sense, until I was 20 years old, all I saw was a universe of extremely competent,
strong women.
Strong and free in their own terms, let's put it this way.
Yes, yeah. I understand you began your career actually in academia. Talk about that, and then the transition to the judiciary.
Virtually everything I've done professionally, I've done by accident. I've never had a career plan. And maybe, again, it's a question of temperament, but that gave me all kinds of opportunities. So when I graduated from law school, I went to clerk at the Supreme Court of Canada. Now in the legal profession, especially when we look at the U.S. model, it's very well known. You know, it's the thing to do, the cream of the... But in our days, it was only, I think, the third year that judges of the Supreme Court of Canada took in law clerks. And I even forgot, I think I saw an ad for it or something, but this was a huge step for me because that meant working in Ottawa, which is in English Canada. And this is another, it's really interesting what gives you a sense of self or how you're perceived by the world. So when I came to apply for that job, I spoke some English because I had worked at Expo 67 as a telephone operator. So I mastered a couple of the vocabulary. And in law school, obviously a lot of the materials were in English. But I was far from fluent. So when I went, I applied for the job. This judge interviewed me. It's very intimidating. I thought I have zero chance because he's going to find out that I just don't speak English well enough for that. He was from Quebec. The whole interview was in French. And towards the end of the interview, he said to me slowly, "How is your English?" And I said, "Good." That was the end of that part of the test. And then he offered me the job on the spot.
Wow.
And to his astonishment, I said, oh, I'll have to think about it. I thought, just a minute, and I'm moving to Ottawa, to the other side, you know, the English. This was like a big deal. And he said, "You thought you never had a chance at this job?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Because you're a woman." I thought, "No, because I don't speak English." But so this is really interesting.
Yes.
The idea that, see, this had not occurred to me, honestly, until then. Gender disparities, gender discrimination was obscured, in a sense, in my life by, in Canada, the very blatant discrimination against French Canadians and the lack of opportunities because you were French-speaking in an environment where the majority were French, but if you tried to get a summer job in a department store, you couldn't because you didn't speak English. So the self-perception of who people view you as a person and who you think you are In the same way, just a small story. Just before I started school, when I was 5 years old, I had an accident. And I had a very big scar. A window fell. Anyway, a huge scar on my face. And until late in life, it was, if I went swimming, it turned blue. It was very red. It was very obvious. Because of that, every time when I started school or I met new kids, invariably they would say to me, what happened to your face? And as a result of that, I had no consciousness that I was very short. Nobody said to me, how come you're so little? They always said, what happened to your face? It's a metaphor to me for your perception of self and the projection of who you are and how the two often don't match.
Oh my gosh, what a journey. What a journey. So here he is. He's offering you this job on the spot. And obviously you took a moment, but you took it.
Yeah.
You took it. What happened then?
So this was really amazing. I mean, you enter the hearts and lungs of the legal profession. The Supreme Court of Canada is where it all gets shaped. And so this was great. In those days, the 9 judges only had 1 clerk each. And that's where I met the man who subsequently was my life partner for almost 30 years, 27 years. So he was from Ontario. And when we decided that maybe we had a future together, then the question was, where are we going to work? I was then a member of the Quebec Bar, so I had passed all the bar exams. But now I was in Ontario. It's a different province. I wasn't called to the bar. In any event, it was simpler to stay in Ontario. So because I had clerked at the Supreme Court, we were targeted by law deans. They were always looking for the law clerks as potential law professors, a career I had never contemplated. To the extent that I had a career plan, which I didn't, but what I would have liked to do criminal defense work if I'd gone back home, which meant small firm. There was already not a lot of women in the profession, but criminal defense was seen as the bottom of the barrel. That's not where the kids who were at the head of the class went for the most part. It was still seen as seedy maybe, and that's what I like. I like marginal people. I like the underground dog. I like that.
Speaking up for someone who may not have a voice.
Yeah, but I didn't think of it. I don't think of myself as a savior or I'm not the voice of anybody else. At best, I could be their megaphone. I could scream, but they have their own voice. And maybe it just intrigues me. I entered the academic world. Not only I didn't have a doctorate, I didn't even have a master's degree. I just had a basic law degree and called to the bar in another province. But this was a really good time. I liked the classroom part of teaching more than the research, which in those days had moved into highly theoretical work, which didn't have terrific appeal to me, but the political side of the law, the social justice change instruments, I really liked. So that's what I did for 12 years. I had 3 kids.
How did you manage that, going between family and work and being committed to your students?
Well, teaching is, in fact, is an idea. When I look at the young women in my law firm now and the hours they have to put in, I don't know how they manage to not only to raise children, I don't know how they manage to have the time to make them, but that's another. It's true. It's crazy. They work insane hours. As a law teacher, I could manage my days. The reality is I worked all the time. My son actually reminds me that every day I would ask him to carry my briefcase up because my room was on the 3rd floor. And he said, I still see you sitting in bed with lots of pillows and tons of papers in front of you. So I did work a lot, but it didn't feel that way. It was a really good life balance, very busy, 3 kids, a cat, a dog, whatever. It was busy. And then I got the magic phone call that many lawyers crave. but that had not entered my consciousness, offering me a judicial appointment.
Wow.
So I became a judge. And the irony of it is, when I finished my college education, so until age of 20, I wore a uniform every day of my life. And when I went to law school, I swore I will never, ever again wear a uniform. Mm-hmm. Then I became a judge.
And you wore a uniform?
I wore a uniform again.
What's it like being a judge? What does it take to be a judge, a good judge?
First of all, it depends at what level. I was appointed at the trial level, where obviously you have a lot of interactions with people, which is very different than the subsequent work I did as an appellate court judge, where you have a lot of interaction with your colleagues. So it's a very different chemistry. Right. And as a trial judge, obviously you're alone. So it's actually very scary for someone like me who, when I became a trial judge, I'd never set foot in a courtroom. I was an academic. No, that's not true. I had taken one case in the Court of Appeal as an intervener for the Canadian Civil Liberties Association as counsel. Mm-hmm. So I'd argued one case for half an hour. I had no trial. Most people who get appointed to the bench have been lawyers in practice for a long time. So it was pretty unusual. Scary, yes. And the features of, first of all your work is done in public. The courtrooms are public. You're the director, the producer, the main character of something that you don't control totally. You don't know what the witness is going to say. You don't know it's going to be a flare-up in the courtroom. You got to be very alive. Mm-hmm. And then at the end of the day, you have to decide. And I have to say two things about the exercise of judgment. First of all, depends in what area, but like in family law, for instance, medical malpractice, all kinds of areas. It's a very humbling experience to be charged with making a decision for two grown-up people who just can't make it for themselves, which is essentially what it comes to. They've reached a point in their lives, sometimes it's in a commercial relationship, mm-hmm. but that has a lot of personal stakes, where they've given up the ability to come to a resolution. They turn to a perfect stranger. They don't know me. I think it is very humbling and it's very sobering. You really have to, you cannot not take that seriously. You sit down. And the other thing is you come out of the trial and these were high court, so mm-hmm. pretty serious matters. You come out, you think you got it, pretty good idea. And then you sit down and sometimes it doesn't write. When you start to write it, you look at the law, the legal precedents, you do the analysis. It's like your pen is not going where, in some cases, your heart would want to go, or even your mind, you think, yeah. And then as you start a more rigorous, breaking it down, all the analysis, you realize, no, this is not going to go. So to me, it shows the tension between intuition and rigor. But the pace, sometimes it's so fast. You don't have the luxury of agonizing. You just have to call it and move on. And there's the comfort, if you're a trial judge, there's an appellate system. Yes. So if you really got it wrong, well, somebody will fix it.
But still, boy, that's a lot of responsibility. Now, Louise, what you're known for and lauded for is your passion for justice, for human rights. I want to talk about that transition, because I know you presided over some pretty earth-shattering decisions at a global level. Talk about that journey.
Well, first, maybe I could describe to you a little bit how things happen. Mm-hmm. Certainly in a professional life like mine that was not self-directed. So, again, this is another generation. And I hate to put it this way because it seems so self-flattering or pretentious, but in my days in that environment, I've never applied for a job in my life. The phone rang. Because that's the way, these were small communities. Everybody knew each other. in the same way that I never thought of having an academic career, and I had one for 12 years, which I liked, I'd never really thought of having a judicial career. First of all, because when you're straight out of law school, you don't think, oh, I'm going to be a judge. First of all, you don't control that. And then I would have never in my life thought that I would do international work. I was already uprooted from French Canada to English Canada, which I could tell you in retrospect was the biggest cultural shock of my entire professional life. This cultural shock was more profound than becoming an international civil servant and traveling all over the world, because it's a deep confrontation with the profound roots of your own culture and lots of things you take for granted because people look like you. They're your fellow Canadians. Mm-hmm. And the fault lines, the cultural fault lines are very profound in some cases. So moving from doing domestic judicial work to international work was very unexpected. I think it's one way to put it. But again, see, at the end, it's rooted in my intuition right at the beginning of my career that what I really liked was criminal law. Criminal defense, I ended up being an international prosecutor, but I was not ambivalent about that. The prosecution at the level that I did for genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, it reaches the same values that I would have had at home defending small criminals for, possession of cannabis or something. There's a level of profound injustice and at both levels, defending at that level and prosecuting at the other. So honestly, I have no idea where that interest of mine or that kind of anchor in justice, particularly in criminal justice and public law, constitutional law, I don't know where it comes from. I think some of it, again, is more temperament or likes and dislikes. I like underdogs. I like marginal issues more than mainstream. And I think the law was a very good fit for me in the sense that it has a high level, but comfortable for me, level of complexity. It's not that hard, but it's hard enough. There are other disciplines that would have been too hard for me, but it's complex enough that it's very intellectually challenging, but it's also grounded in social and moral issues, which I like, as opposed to other disciplines or intellectual exercise or little games that I like playing cards. I like all games. I like Wordle, but I don't pretend that it has any socially redeeming virtue. Yes. But the law does.
Absolutely.
So as an instrument for me, it's been a very comfortable and very attractive way of having a professional life. I ended up doing this international work because, just the way it happened is so bizarre. I was then, I think, on the Ontario Court of Appeal, and I got a call from a fellow judge from another province whom I barely knew, and he said he had accepted to go to a conference in South Africa, but couldn't go, and would I go? I'd never been to Africa. And I remember telling him, this would have been 1987, 88. I said, don't we have sanctions? We don't go. No. He said, this is Canadian government supporting that. It's helping the legal profession, judges and lawyers, to start envisaging a post-apartheid constitutional system. And they want to talk to us because we've had a new Bill of Rights, entrenched Bill of Rights in 1982. It's very recent. We've just been there. So I found myself in Johannesburg. First time in Africa, all by myself. And I stayed in contact. And there I met Richard Goldstone, who became the first prosecutor, blah, blah. And I remember we talked a lot about equality issues, non-discrimination, but also they were way ahead of even our thinking. Should they entrench environmental rights? We hadn't done that. Social and economic rights. Anyway, lots of... So yeah, I met them. They invited me the second year for a meeting of the Bar Association. And then Richard became the first war crimes prosecutor. At some point he came to Toronto. He came to Toronto to talk to me because he had to go back. He was on the Constitutional Court of South Africa, and all the big issues were coming up, death penalty. And so he came to Toronto, and we had dinner with his wife, who's great. And he said, I have to leave the war crimes prosecution, Yugoslavia and Rwanda. The Secretary General wants names for my replacement. Can I give your name? Yes, this is so ridiculous. He will not.
But you said yes.
But I said, yeah. Well, of course, yeah, that would be. But I said, Richard, this will never work. I don't know anything about war, the laws of war. I don't know the difference between a general, a major, a sergeant, armies, rules of engagement. I know nothing. But the underpinning is still criminal law. It's just criminal law with a big spin. Mm-hmm. So that's how I found myself in The Hague. I'd never set foot at UN headquarters. So I was appointed, at the level of an Undersecretary General of an organization that I knew nothing about. And there you go.
And there you go.
That's another sort of little piece of insight. Because, you and I often talk about leadership. And, what is very bizarre in my life when I look back on it is I've never had a boss, ever.
What do you mean?
Well, when I worked for my judge, he was sort of my boss. But, my boss, it's him and me. When I was an academic, the dean, not really your boss. I mean, he can't tell me, well, he could ask me what to teach, but he can't force me to teach something I don't know. It's more like, what's the word, primus inter partes?
Explain
a
that.
Dean is the leader of the pack, but he's not your superior. He's like an intellectual beacon, I think, externally, and a super administrator, but he's not your boss. He can't, you have academic freedom, he can't fire you. Then I became a judge. Well, same thing. The Chief Justice is not your boss. He administers the court. He can't tell you how to decide a case. He can't force you, he could organize the assignments, but anyway, you don't have a boss really. And in the case of performance evaluation, when I was a law teacher, not my dean who evaluated me is never in my classroom, so it was always students' evaluations, which were public. Oh, I have a good one on that.
We'll come back to that.
Yeah. So then I was a judge I didn't have. Then when I went to the UN, the hyper hierarchy, I had 2 jobs in the UN, well, a third one recently, both of which were completely independent. When I was the chief prosecutor for the tribunals for Yugoslavia, Rwanda, first of all, I was appointed by the Security Council upon recommendation of the Secretary General, but he didn't appoint me, so he couldn't fire me. And the statute made it explicit: the prosecutor shall not seek or receive instruction from any source, any member state. And I took the position that included the Secretary General, which came as a bit of a surprise to his legal advisor, but that's another issue. So as the prosecutor, I had no boss. Yeah. And then as the High Commissioner for Human Rights, subsequently, yes, first of all, the appointment is by the General Assembly. So again, not the Secretary General can't fire you. And of course, you're part of his big executive team. But as the High Commissioner for Human Rights, you are also expected to have a very independent voice in the UN system. So I'm often asked to reflect on leadership, but I've never had a kind of progress through the rank of observing different layers and maturity of leadership, not from a personal experience anyway.
I want to go back to a couple of things, but we're going to come back to your students and what your students had to say about you. You said something really interesting, that the most profound shift was going from French-speaking to an English-speaking world, and that there are deep cultural fault lines. And I imagine that's true the world over, between peoples, sometimes even within families. Those fault lines, how does one navigate fault lines, particularly in conflict? And a conflict could be at a small c, within a family, within a community, or could be with a capital C, that is between countries, and where the consequences could be devastating. How do you stumble onto fault lines, uncover them, and what do you do? Do we create bridges across them, or do we navigate around them?
I think the first thing is just to recognize them. And that's why I said, for me, this shift, it's not just language. It's not just moving from operating essentially mostly in French to professionally and personally in French, professionally in English. It's not just that. It's, first of all, it's making the assumption that your fellow citizens, especially for me, having grown up in such a homogeneous environment, all girls, all French Canadians, all Catholics, we were at the macro level like little clones of each other. Of course, at the personal level, there were immense differences. But the assumption that your fellow citizens are just like you, for me, was shattered when I realized that it's not because, apart from gender, they all look like me. Because in those days, Canada was still quite a homogeneous country. So starting even with this superficial homogeneity, there's such profound, very profound assumptions about how you live your life, about your level of religiousness, for instance, of who is in the establishment. And, these are not class systems, but professional classes. And so I came to this environment with a set of assumptions that I realized quickly were very superficial and unfounded. That idea I carried easily elsewhere. So I don't make assumptions about people. I don't make assumptions about, certainly not about what they're worth. That's another thing. When you think I was a judge, it's true. But I have never, and I never, ever judge people. That's not what judging, it's not passing a moral judgment. No, it's applying rules. It's not personal. It's So I think in all situations, the capacity, first of all, to acknowledge that your point of view is not the universal point of view. It's just one, and one could call that a kind of form of political empathy. The intellectual capacity to distance yourself from your baggage and make an effort to see the world from somebody else's point of view, which actually I think in negotiations, that's the highest quality. Because to only be smart at articulating your position's not that hard. But to be able to really figure out where's the red line on the other side, where is she going to be prepared to yield, and where can I meet that, I think pays off much more. But some people seem absolutely incapable of getting outside their own.
And standing in the shoes of someone else.
And that's why I'm very suspicious of conversations that put too quickly on the table things like, these are my values. Because your values are not negotiable. Your interests are negotiable. So the world of values and passion, intuitively, I like to take a step back from that and say, could we come down to something a little more pedestrians, like your interests, which I think are more negotiable.
But even finding that common space where interests may genuinely be shared takes work, takes observation, takes listening, and also takes, in some ways, standing outside of yourself again. When you think about it, I think about the cases you've had to preside over, the level of independence that was just paramount, and yet the level of consultation that must have also taken place, listening, consulting the law, but also you work with peers in other jurisdictions. How did you manage that? Because it sounds on one level incredibly lonely, and yet at the same time I knew there was a community, that balance.
Well, I think our lives are full of paradoxes. And, like, for instance, a lot of the things I've described to you about parts of my life would suggest that I'm very independent, and therefore, like in the judicial world, for instance, a lot of people celebrate dissidents, the great dissenter, the courageous, smart one that sees what nobody else can see and will stand for it. I've dissented in some cases, but I've only done that very reluctantly. I like consensus. I like to be part of the one that shapes the consensus. And not everything has to be on my terms. Mm-hmm. Now, where are the red lines? That's where I will never say, values and principles. To me, it's more having made every effort to consolidate a consensus. If I feel that it's just too high a price to pay, I will still dissent, but only where I have to. So I will express myself as a member of the consensus up to that point. Because and frankly, unless if you have a very big ego, if you dissent, like some people say, well, the dissenter is the voice of the future. Well, sometimes not. But if you're in the consensus, that's the order of the day, that it works like right now.
Yes.
So sometimes it's better to gain less, but to move
something forward.
Yes.
Move it forward.
Than to stand on the moral high ground, largely unoccupied, with no immediate benefit, and possibly sometimes it is the way of the future, but sometimes it's just ego flattering.
Yes. No, it's so true. Let's go back to those students. What did they have to say about Professor Arbour?
Well, that's it. So these students' evaluations, in my days, the way it was done, it was on a given date towards the end of term. You didn't know ahead of term. Somebody would walk into your classroom, ask you to leave. They give the students sheets of paper. And some of them were just ticking, on a range of 1 to 10. Does she speak loud enough? All kinds of stuff. And there was space at the bottom of the sheet for personal comments. Yeah, general comments. And these blocks of evaluations were then put in the library for the students for subsequent years to choose, if they were 3 sections of the same subject, they could choose which prof they wanted. So they would go, this stuff is out there in the library. So when I had my first child, I had my 3 kids when I was teaching. So I was pregnant with Emily, due to give birth at the beginning of March. So when I went and told, first of all, nobody had ever been pregnant.
And teach.
They were no women. So I go see my dean and I said, I'm pregnant. I could see his administrative mind go into, oh my God, what are we going to do? So he said, what do you think? I said, well, why don't I talk to my students about options? So either we could condense the course and we'll do the exam before the beginning of March, which would mean an additional hour per week, or I could hire someone to replace me to finish the course, but I'll mark the exam. Anyway, I gave them 3 or 4 options. I left the classroom. They debated. I came back. What do you want? They said, we can't add another hour because we all have different schedules, so you'll have to hire somebody to... Or I said, I could not teach the course at all, but what am I going to do for 2 months? Anyway, they said, hire somebody to finish the course. So I found someone. Didn't work out as well as I had hoped, apparently, according to the evaluations. But the way it was put by one, I assume a guy, because nobody else would think in those terms. One of the questions was, how could this course have been improved? He wrote, by the pill.
By the pill.
I assume this was meant as a compliment.
Oh my gosh! No,
that goes.
It
Yeah.
was right up there. Now, Louise, you also talked about 3 kids coming through, your partner, life partner, who I believe was also a lawyer.
Mm-hmm.
How did both of you manage and navigate this? Busy careers, 3 kids. Any of these kids in the law as well?
Only my oldest daughter
Okay.
is a lawyer. Yeah. Very similar pattern.
Very similar.
Yeah.
Okay.
She clerked at the Supreme Court of Canada. You know, this, yeah.
Some patterns repeat. Some
Yeah,
patterns
but not all.
Okay.
Not all. I always believe in a lot of freedom.
Yes.
To live their lives as long as they're happy and I'm there, it's good.
That's good.
Yeah, we had 2 professional careers, but that's the funny thing is we worked sort of together for a long time. We worked at the Supreme Court of Canada as law clerks together, and then he went to teach at Osgoode Hall Law School, and I joined the law school the subsequent year, first as a lecturer, and then he went into private practice and different things. But yeah, and I see them now today. I'm counsel in a law firm at BLG in the Montreal office. I look at the young women. I could still hear my mother say to me, how can you do it? With, you both have these big jobs and 3 kids. And I thought, I don't know what she's talking about. You get up in the morning, you just go. And catch your breath. And now I look at my daughter with 3 kids and my young colleagues with 3 kids. And I'm thinking, oh my God, how do they do it? It seems inconceivable to me that young women can still manage and accomplish so much professionally in I think, a work environment that's even more demanding than it was when I was there, with constant solicitation by email and text and the complexity.
Yeah, the pace and the complexity.
The volume of stuff you must consult and digest. And we complained in my days that we didn't have enough. We didn't have enough good books of doctrine. There was not enough literature. Now, I don't know.
Overwhelming.
Totally overwhelming.
Overwhelming amount. I'm going to depart a little bit to talk about how you just contributed. You told me this. You've mentioned the dog a couple times. Yeah, the dog when you and your mom up and left and took all of you,
and the dog,
and the dog, and the dog. And I remember you told me a story about working with a charity on its board, which prepares dogs and gives dogs to people who are blind or who have some kind of impairment in terms of their vision, and who need a dog. Tell me a little bit more about that. There's something lovely about how because your face lights up. I remember when you first told me a story about this wonderful dog, and I think you brought one of those dogs home. It's a retired dog, or maybe a not as well behaved dog who came home with you. Just tell me a little bit about that experience.
The work. In fact, I just finished my 9-year terms on the board of that foundation. It's called the MIRA Foundation in Quebec. It's an amazing organization, and so it's at the other extreme of the Mastercard Foundation, because it's a small, very targeted work type organization. And for me, it's complete self-indulgence to have worked with them. So it was founded 30 years ago by one guy who used to, for some reason, he was training attack dogs, like guard dogs.
Guard dogs.
Dogs that guard factories at night, that bite people and bark. And he hated it. He felt that the whole world hated him and the dogs, and yet he loved dogs. So he got this idea of starting to train dogs as service dogs, originally really for people who were visually impaired. And then it grew into people with mobility issues, people who are in wheelchairs and had a dog with them. And now increasingly we work with children on the autism spectrum, and for emotional support to traumatized children in particular, or women, when they have to tell their stories, either to the police or even in a courtroom. We have these emotional support dogs. They sense the tension in the storytelling, and they'll
be right there.
Yeah. They're amazing dogs. It's a huge amount of training. So when they're born, they go to a foster family until they're about 1, just to be socialized. And then they come back for assessment. And the ones who are, interesting, the females who are the best at every level, intelligence, sensitivity, trainability, they go into reproduction. Which is a nice life. I mean, it's not a puppy mill. But they're the future.
They are the future.
They are.
And hopefully they pass on the genes about that emotional
And it only
intelligence,
takes 2 or 3 males, but 16, 17 females. Anyway, that in and of itself, the whole genetics and stuff is interesting. And then the foundation gives away, up to 200 dogs a year to people in need as service dogs. So, and of course, the one I got 9 years ago just died in the fall.
Sorry.
So I'm in the lineup for another reject, because the ones we could take are the ones who are not
quite there. Louise, your life, I just think about what you said, raised by a phenomenal mother, courageous, in many ways defiant of her times, even though she may have been preoccupied with fitting in or maybe not, or being aware of having not fit in. Raised by other women, and you really have navigated all kinds of fault lines throughout your career. And whether you think it was serendipitous, accidental, unplanned, I see a thread all the way through about using a megaphone to speak to justice, to speak for the underdog, but mostly for people who have been on the margin, who right down to this story you've spoken about, this charity. And I hope the work that we do at the Mastercard Foundation, we're so honored that you're on our board, that you are that voice. You are that voice, which always brings us back. I don't know whether it's to consensus, but you bring us back and to pay attention to fault lines. And while I know it's not always about these airy-fairy things and perhaps these intangibles, but it is about ensuring that we are here for the interests of humanity, and about seeing each other, not making assumptions, but really trying to empathize with the context in which people have to live and have to work. So I just want to thank you. Thank you.
You hear it from everyone, what a privilege it is to work with an organization that has, again, the right mix of extraordinary capacity, not only financial, but in terms of the pool of talent that it has attracted and has put in place. So enormous capacity and a willingness to have an impact, but if it has to be the hard way, that to me is very critical, that we're not in the low-hanging fruit business of self-congratulation for great accomplishments. I think this organization is such a perfect fit for everything I've ever stood for, except this time with capacity that at other stages in my life I didn't have at that level. I think it's... I have to tell you, in my life, there were times where I was very suspicious of philanthropy. I thought, well, why don't we have an adequate fiscal system, tax system? And if you're a real Democrat, in the general sense of the word, why is it that this board of 12 people with a fantastic CEO makes all these decisions? Where's the rest of the world? But I've changed my mind, as you can see.
Oh, okay, I'm glad to hear that. But I hope you always keep us walking that line to constantly listen, especially now to listen to young people across Africa and indigenous communities in Canada, and to have that empathy you spoke about, so that we also center ourselves on finding that consensus for the greater good.
Yeah, and I think if we keep in mind that we are not their voice.
We aren't.
They have a voice. We are their megaphone. Yeah. Or today it's not called a megaphone, it's probably called some other instrument. Thing. But I think it's really important that we never think that we speak for them or that they don't have vocal cords.
Yes. They do. And we hear it and we listen.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Louise.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Have so much fun doing this. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Honorable Louise Arbour's life and career exemplify the profound impact that one individual, one woman, can have on the pursuit of global justice. From student to Chief Prosecutor, International Criminal Tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. From research officer to Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada. From mother and grandmother to advocate for global human rights for all. Louise Arbour is an outstanding example of transcending boundaries.